Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas noches a todas las personas que nos están acompañando el día de hoy en este miércoles de SOMA. Yo le doy la bienvenida a la artista Garner, quien utiliza el performance, la escultura, la fotografía y el video para construir espacios ficticios, paisajes que se reorientan de lo innato a lo ideológico y que exploran la capacidad de desconfiar de las imágenes y su capacidad por documentar. Ella ha expuesto en Phoenix Center for the Arts, en ITD Los Ángeles, entre otros lugares. Este miércoles de SOMA será en inglés y recuerden que pueden hacer comentarios y preguntas a través del chat de YouTube. A lo largo de la charla se irán contestando. Ana, thank you for being here and welcome to Miércoles de SOMA.
Gracias. Pues gracias a SOMA por invitarme y gracias a todos que se juntaron. Y aunque daré la práctica en inglés, si alguien tiene una pregunta que quiere preguntarme en español, sería bien. Y puedo responder en español. And just 1 second and I will share my screen. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, and so thank you everyone for coming and joining me. Like she said in the introduction, I work primarily in photography and video, but within that, I bring in elements of sculpture and performance. So primarily for me, the final outcome of my work is either video or photography, but those will have performative components within it, or they will be photographs of sculptures. And I will be showing you work that spans through about the last 8 years, starting with this piece, Sequential Interactions, from 2013. And I'll let it play a little bit and kind of talk in between. So this piece was a part of a series that I created between 2013 and 2014. And it was a series of 5 videos that I showed together in an exhibition titled Proof and Permutations. And all of these videos, for me, they were very experimental in nature. I had primarily had a background of photography, and when I went to grad school in 2011, I started to just really want to push myself away from photography and look at what else I could be doing. And video was a way for me to do that, to be more experimental, to be more loose in my practice. Because for me, photography, it's my technical background, and so I tend to be very tight with it. And so working in video really allowed me a lot more freedom in the way that I was working and to explore different themes in the work. We'll move on to the next one already. So some of these, I'll show some of these all the way through, and some of them I'm just gonna kind of show clips of. Most of these videos are pretty short. They range between 2 minutes to maybe 5 minutes. And for me, when I was working on these videos, what I was thinking about is creating these physical interactions for myself that were primarily about exploring discomfort and my own reaction to those discomforts. And I was primarily using objects that were ready-made. And so, you know, like the balloons from the other video that are easily found in just about any store, and then the cinder blocks, which you can find at, you know, pretty much any hardware store. The videos that are part of this series have 2 different elements to them. One is either that they are an interaction with an object where I am altering and or destroying that object, and there's some way in which through that process I'm also being physically altered. In the sense of that, the first one that you saw with the liquid that's pouring on my body as I'm popping the balloons, and also just in the discomfort of the action. The other component with these videos was interacting with objects where there was resistance between myself and the object. So like the one that we're watching right now, surrogates, there's resistance between me and the object. I'm trying to push them apart, but I'm not able to. So there's also a failure within that. Another thing that really interested me in utilizing these objects was the contrast between the really rough texture of the cinder block and then the essentially like very soft skin of my face. And so the point of contact having that tension between softness and the hard and rough surface that in this action was very immovable for me. And also for me, because I do come from a photography background, many of the times when I work with video, it's a single take, because I think in many ways, when I'm working in video, I think about it a lot through the lens of photography. And so how an image functions, and not working with cuts and wanting to frame that one really nice image. Okay. And then here's another one from that series titled Unyielding. And so again, this one is thinking about that idea of resistance. And this was one where it was the first time that instead of just seeking out objects that were ready-made, I really specifically created this sort of weird sculptural costume that's around my waist and that's hanging from my shoulders. And the idea was to create it in a way where it was, just barely too big to fit through the doorway. And to continue to try and do that over and over and over again. In addition, this was one of the few videos from this series that doesn't take place within a studio setting. So normally when I work, whether it is in photography or in video, I work within a controlled studio setting where I have backdrop papers and lights, and I'm controlling all these different components of it. So this is one of the few where I'm using like an actual space outside of the studio, because I wanted to, have that interaction with the doorway. Okay, and I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. And this is just two images of the installation of that work. And I think looking at the images of the installation, for me, it becomes a lot more clear of when I do work with video, how there's a lot of ways I use it like photography, in the sense that when I create a video, I'm not necessarily creating a video that I want someone to watch linearly. That for me, it's okay if somebody doesn't see the entirety of the video and can see, maybe 30 seconds in between, and still have an understanding of what's happening and the motion and the action. And in that way, it can function somewhat like an image where it can be approached. You can walk up to it, you can walk away, you can come back. It's not a linear video where you need to sit through the entire thing to understand it. And also in regards to exhibiting video work and this work in particular, I was very much interested in the relation between the videos and how they worked together to create a series, to create complementary actions, and then also to create really a cacophony of noises. Because the the sound in these pieces is relatively subtle, yet when they're overlaying each other, it really builds up, and those subtle kind of pops or bumps or scrapes, they become something a little bit more impactful when they're heard together. And please, like, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat, and I will be answering questions at the end, but just go ahead and put them in the chat so you don't forget. So, okay, let me see. Okay. Making sure that that video was going to work. Okay, so from those 3 videos that I showed you, again, it was a series of 5. I'm only going to show those 3. I did 2 works right after that both dealt with falling. So the first one is called Pratfall, and I created this one also in 2014. And I was thinking a lot at this time more about vulnerability with the body and the instability of the body. And I don't know if those of you out there are familiar with the artist Patty Chang. She was somebody who was a really big influence for me when I was starting to work with video. And there was a particular video that she made where she was walking down a hallway and the floor suddenly it looked almost like a waterbed. And so she just immediately fell and couldn't get back up. And I was really interested in the way that she was just showing like her own vulnerability and the kind of instability of the body in itself. And that was something that I really wanted to portray within my own work. And in the videos that I showed you before, I think I was starting to hint at that, but I wanted a way to address that much more directly. I was also at this time looking at a lot of slapstick comedy. So a lot of like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin from their early silent work. And I was thinking a lot about how they used their body and how they communicated with their bodies. And I was very interested in this contrast in slapstick comedy where the body always looked like it was at risk because that's what was funny. What was funny was the body falling over or being hit on the head or everything falling apart around the actor and the actor just sort of standing still and still being okay. And there was this weird tension between that risk of the body, but then also the fact that they practiced their stunts over and over and over. And so there was also this really practiced safety to it. And I wanted to find a way to communicate that tension between the safety and the risk. And for me, that's what I was trying to do in this video of intentionally putting my own body at risk, making the decision to sit on this board and saw it off. And have that action be incredibly slow, because whereas in a slapstick film, the action will generally take about 30 seconds at most. And then the actor is on the floor and we're laughing. And so I wanted that moment to be much more drawn out. One of the things I also have found about this particular video, and the next one I'll show you as well, is that I noticed that viewers will, because it is a very monotonous action, they will not necessarily want to watch the whole thing, but then they'll turn away and then I'll fall and then they will be upset that they didn't see it. And so there's this frustration of sort of forcing the viewer to watch to get that one little moment out of the entire, I think this video is, okay, there we go, there's the fall. So the video is like about 4 minutes and 20 seconds. For me, there's also a dynamic happening in this video of creating also a space of the unknown. And so the space is very tight and controlled. It's very clean, the line of the wood in the middle, and yet we don't, the viewer doesn't see where that piece of wood ends or begins. So there is that unknown question of what's happening before we see the fall. And then on the other side of the slide, I just have an image of the video installed at a show at a space called Haunt Gallery in Vancouver, Canada. And that was from, I don't know, about 5 years ago. And then, yeah, so another thing that I'm actually going to be showing a lot of tonight is in process images. So I'm going to be showing you guys a lot of images in the studio and how I work. For me, it's a really important thing to share as an artist, because I think that sometimes that mystery of how something is made, I think it can be a really great thing. And I also think it can be something that's maybe intimidating. And I'm also a very process-oriented artist. And for me, so much of my work and my content develops through the process of making it. And so sharing that background of what actually things look like, I think is incredibly important and also beneficial for me. So this is my studio where I shot this work. I shot it while I was at a residency, Skowhegan in Maine. And I had the facilities people come and deliver those 2 beds that you see underneath there, not really knowing what I was going to do with them. And so I think also when we see this larger picture of what's happening, there's also that information of the background of that there was some ways I was keeping myself safe by putting these mattresses underneath. And yet it's also, I'm falling about 6 feet with a saw in my hand. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this work is called Just Below, and this one was made in 2016, so just a couple of years after I made Pratfall. And I was still thinking about those same ideas around creating a space and a structure in which to force myself to fall. So I wanted to work in ways where it was very intentional, that it wasn't somebody else who was making me fall or some outside force or element, that it was really specifically me as the artist and the performer that was doing that. And this video was the first time that I built such a large structure for a video piece and for a performance. And it took me I did this one again at another residency at Bemis in Omaha, Nebraska. And I built this in my studio there. It took me maybe a month and a half or 2 to build it, from conception of like starting with thinking about the idea and drawing it out and deciding on the materials. And I'm not a sculptor by background. So for me, when I do sculptural work, it often takes me a little bit longer to problem solve. And the outside structure is made out of wood, and then the plinth that I'm standing on top of is cast plaster. So I made a square mold and cast it, and it's about 3 inches thick. On the left side of the slide is an image of the work installed. And this was at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery about 2 years ago. And for me, this was the maybe the one time where I exhibited the work where I felt like it was shown exactly how I wanted it to, because they put it, you can see it, they kind of put it in this little niche in this little hallway where it was all alone. And for me, what I thought about a lot with this piece was architecture. And so being able to have it within that space that played with the architecture and really isolated it, and then also had these really clean lines against that sort of like classical Greek style of that interior there, for me was a really good contrast. I'm gonna let this video I'm gonna let play all the way through. So I may just pause a bit until I move on to the next slide to talk about some more elements of it. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. Okay, and then here I just wanted to show you a little bit of moving from inception of the work to kind of the aftermath of it. And that's, the drawing is literally like a scan from my sketchbook that has all of my notes, just thinking through, why am I doing this? How am I building this? And yeah, just a lot of why. And then one of the reasons I really wanted to show an image of the aftermath is because for me, it really displays clearly my interest and desire to show a contrast between the really controlled space and the lines of the structure versus the destruction and what happens within the space. I'll say another thing I was looking at a lot at this point was the dancer Trisha Brown. And I had encountered her work probably in my mid-20s. I had studied dance for a long time, including a lot of postmodern dance and improvisational forms of dance. And I encountered her work through that. And the thing that most interested me about her work was that through the way that the dancers interacted with space, it actually really changed our perception of that space and of the physical architecture, because they would walk on the walls or they would move these simple wood beams in different ways that would create their own structures. And so it was about the perception of space and changing space through the body. And that for me was one of the things I was thinking about. One of my goals was with this work was to create something that did something similar. Another component of this specific work, I was thinking a lot about minimalist sculpture and the use of the monolith form in minimalist sculpture. And the ways that the slickness of minimalism and the masculinity of the monolith could be challenged through what I was doing. And so whereas the space of a minimalist sculpture would be anti-emotional and almost perfect, what I was creating was imbued with motion, tension, stress, anxiety through what I was doing. And so in doing that, I was thinking about really challenging those ideas about how these types of objects function, and how they're revered, and how they reflect that masculinity. Okay, moving on. So like I said, most of my work is photography and or video, but again, there's sculptural elements to it. For a while, I was working a little bit more directly with sculpture. And so I'm going to show you just two of those pieces. This one is from 2016, and it's called Gravity is the Weakest Force. And it's made from wood and just acrylic paint. And the two pieces of sculpture that I will show you are similar thematically to the videos that I just showed. So they reference ideas around falling or things falling apart or perceptions of space not functioning in expected ways. This particular piece I had from the period where I was looking at slapstick comedy. I was also thinking about cartoons, and cartoons being an extension of slapstick. And so many of the ways that the physical space of cartoons functioned was very similar to how slapstick comedy functioned, in terms of things would fall down, would not make sense. And in particular, probably many of us have watched cartoons where somebody would draw a boulder or a rock in the sky, and then suddenly it becomes real, and then it falls and smashes like what Wile E. Coyote or whatever other character. And so I was thinking about that and wanting to replicate in some way that idea of tracing something and then it falls out, and thinking about the sky behind that piece that's falling out. And then this piece that's called Catch Me If I Fall. So again, falling is in the title. This one was thinking back to slapstick comedy and the sets of those films, and how the set design would be created to fall apart, but not completely. So for example, an actor might, walk into a wall, but suddenly that wall swivels and turns, and then he's on the other side of something, or suddenly a set of stairs turns into a slide. And so there's always things that are changing or falling apart, but yet they completely stay together. And so I was thinking about that dynamic, and wanting to create these semi-architectural pieces that were starting to come apart, and meant to look like the interior framing of a wall. And then the piece that's on the floor, that's part of this installation of the piece, is made out of fired stoneware, and it's a replica of a cardboard box. And probably most people aren't familiar or aware, because I had no idea until I just went into this rabbit hole of looking at all these different things. But a lot of stunt workers would use stacks of cardboard boxes to break their falls. And so I created a series of different configurations of all of these cardboard boxes that were made out of ceramic. And so clearly didn't function to actually catch anyone or protect them. And then for me, so going from these pieces, I had been working with sculpture for a little bit, and for me, there was always something, not necessarily something that was missing, but I was always looking for something maybe just a little bit more in the sculptures that I was creating. And like I have said many times already in the talk, my background has been in photography. And so I started to think about how I could use photography as one extra form of manipulation for the sculpture. And kind of another layer of adding meaning to it, and also as a means of editing, which is something that I think is clear from my video work, that I'm very interested in creating a frame and editing out information, and controlling what is in front of that frame. So I started thinking about photographing my sculptures, and this is one of the first instances of me doing that, and it's called When the Ground is Lost. This piece will also mark a shift in my work and also kind of in this lecture in terms of theme. So for me, this is when I also started looking at mountains and geography as a primary theme of my work, and many different kind of components within that. And with each project I show you, I'll go into kind of a different part. With this one, I was thinking a lot about the top of the mountain, the peak, the summit, and everything that gets lost when that's the only thing that one sees or aims for, or you're sort of then always just looking up. And there's all these things that you don't see that are within the climb up to the top or just around the space of the mountain. This one is called Night Sky with Matterhorns. Very similar to the other one in the sense of depicting mountains and doing that through the form of a diptych. And this one actually, if anyone happens to be tuning in from New York, this is up in a show at Simone Subal Gallery and will be up for 2 or 3 more days. So if you are in New York. And this piece, so the title is Night Sky with Matterhorns. The sculptural component of it, what you can kind of see is that really, really dark shape that's sort of like a mountain. It was a sculpture that I created out of plaster and then ended up pouring silicone over it. And it's a replica of the Matterhorn, but not the Matterhorn in Europe, the Matterhorn ride at Disneyland. That's the bobsled ride. And there's a lot of elements for me within this piece. And primarily, one of the things I first started thinking about is my experience of that ride and of looking up at that mountain as a child. Because I grew up in San Diego, so Disneyland was really close. So I have a lot of childhood memories from there. And I was thinking about how this mountain in the middle of an amusement park becomes an experience of nature and becomes a mediation of nature. And thinking specifically about the history of the Matterhorn mountain and ways that it was tied with European imperialism, because it was part of this, what they called the quote unquote golden age of alpinism. And it was the last of the peaks of the Alps to be summited. And I was thinking a lot about how alpinism and mountaineering is really intertwined with empire and with the need or desire to control land, to control resources, to be heroic or superior over those spaces, and in doing so to claim ownership and to sort of expand so I'll move on to the next slide because I want to talk a little bit more about one, about the production, and then also kind of the space of representing the mountain specifically from Disneyland and not from the actual mountain. So the image on the right is my wife's older sister. Sometime in the 80s, clearly standing in front of the Matterhorn at Disneyland. And that there's this sort of strange thing that's happening because we have the Matterhorn background, mountain in the background, and there's this weird forced perspective where it almost looks real. But then there's a palm tree, and then there's, I think, maybe a citrus tree, and then the cable wire for the gondolas, and then this giant Disney balloon. And so there's this weird disconnection and dissonance from whether or not that mountain is real or not, that I was interested in exploring within that piece. In addition, for me, this piece, it's very dark. The top portion of the image, or the image on the top, is out of focus. And so for me, what I wanted that to communicate is that there's a lot that we don't know, or that is hidden within the context of what this mountain is, when it's only experienced like it is here as the ride at Disneyland. And then talking a little bit about the production of the piece. So the image on the other side of the slide on the left, that's me carving the piece. So I poured a large cardboard box full of plaster so I could have a block to work out of, and then chiseled it away. And for me, this was a piece that took me maybe 3 years, 3 years-ish to complete. Not because it took me that long to literally carve the piece, but it took me that long to decide how I wanted to finish and resolve it. And it was one of those pieces that sat on my shelf for a really long time. And I just kept coming back to it every once in a while and thinking, oh, what am I going to do with this one, and how am I going to finish it? And again, for me, it was through photographing it where I felt like I was able to create that manipulation that I wanted to more clearly communicate these ideas around the mediation of nature and what can be underneath these seemingly like docile or like friendly postcard images. Like the image of my wife's sister in front of it is very much a like family album postcard image, but then there's all of these other things behind that actual mountain. And it's almost impossible for that mountain to exist without those contexts. And then I wanted to just show a couple images that I was using as reference and research as I was creating this piece. And again, looking at like literally how this ride was constructed and how they based it off of the original mountain. And for me, there was also very much this interest of, because Disney's ride was already a replica, of continuing to just replicate it again and again. So to look at Disney's Matterhorn, create my own replica, and then photograph that replica so that it becomes further and further removed from what the original mountain really was. Okay. So a little bit of a break from talking about mountains or landscape. The next series that I'll show you is called Protecting Popo. And it does have a little bit of relation to mountains because the title is pulled from Popocatépetl, the volcano outside of Mexico City. And I used that title for two, maybe three reasons. One, the model that I was working with for these images was from Mexico City. And so it made sense to sort of pull some of him into the naming of the piece. Two, I was thinking about the body as landscape and the ways that his body draped over me created the form of a mountain, created a landscape. And then three, I was interested in the mythology behind the mountain and that love story between Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl. And using that to express the tenderness that came through in these images of the performances with this person. There's two images in the series, View A and View B, and I titled them View A and View B because I wanted a reference to sculpture. And I'll back up a little bit though. The inception of these pieces, what I was thinking about was my own physical size. So I'm 4'11" and very petite, and I think that I've lifted weights for many, many years, and there's always this desire for me to want to physically sort of prove myself, kind of like despite my size, which I think is something very common. And so I started thinking also about really how to use my size within my work. Because additionally, many people would see my videos and then meet me afterwards and comment that I looked bigger in my videos than I did in person. And so I thought about how I could use that again within the video. So that was one of the things that started me thinking about creating this work, as well as specifically wanting to work with a bodybuilder. And I was looking for somebody who was 200 pounds or heavier and at least 6 feet tall. And I'm going to skip forward just a little. So on the left-hand side is an image of me actually lifting him. And where one of the places this work started was at a residency at the Torrance Art Museum, which is just outside of LA. And so I started by staging these images live in the gallery of the museum. And so it was essentially a performance because I was doing it live. And the idea was for me to find ways to lift him, which was much harder than I initially thought. And so it really became a negotiation between me and him about finding ways for me to take his weight and do it safely. So it became very, very intimate and very much a negotiation. And so for me, the resulting images communicate about representations of strength and the fluidity between strength and tenderness, and also like really specifically looking at, representations of power and strength as they relate to race and gender, and trying to find a space in which those things could be fluid, and a space in which, me as a really petite person can be lifting him. This is just a little anecdote because this is, actually I'm looking at it right now. It is still on my studio wall. It's been on my studio wall for maybe at least 4 years. And it was on my studio wall as I was thinking about this piece. And for me, there was just something I really loved about like seeing this woman who is lifting Arnold Schwarzenegger on her shoulders. And it was, an image that really kind of, I was looking at to think about depictions of strength. And obviously particularly depictions of strength and gender. Like I mentioned, I titled the images View A and View B. And so that was referential around sculpture and the way that sculpture is photographed to see different views. And I wanted the poses to look sculptural, for his muscles to come through in ways that felt sculptural. And in addition, it's maybe a little bit more clear here, but the images are printed very large. So 48 by 60 inches. And so when they're printed, the size makes them more sculptural as well, because they have this very kind of intense physical presence. But going back to these two sculptures that are at the Art Institute of Chicago. So on the right, we have a late Renaissance sculpture of Hercules and Lycus. And on the other side, we have a neoclassical Bacchus consoling Ariadne. And for me, I was looking at these and thinking about how the one on the right is two men fighting. And so there's this contest of strength, the depiction of strength, the depiction of somebody who's clearly the victor because he's holding this person up. And then versus on the other side, we have a woman who looks like she's possibly fainting, who is being supported by this male figure. And so I wanted to find something that could be in between, where the gender representation didn't have to be just the woman being held up or the man being the one fighting. I wanted to find something more fluid, something that could be between these two types of representations. Okay, I'm going to play this for you guys as well. So this for me, I really don't do much live performance. This is one of the few live performances I have done, and very clearly thinking about these same types of things around size and strength and competition. And this is a piece I don't usually show this piece. I have the video documentation just to more share with people on an individual basis when it makes sense. But this was a piece I created in 2014, again, while I was at a residency, Skowhegan. And for those who are not familiar, the person that I'm performing with is another artist, Martin Kurcels, who does a lot of his own work about size and about the fact that he's about, I think, 6'4", 6'5", and 200 to 300 pounds. And so in a lot of his work, he's used his size by throwing people or falling over and finding ways to just talk about the comforts or discomforts of being larger. And so I wanted to create work with him that could be in conversation with that and work with my own size. And so we talked about doing this together and essentially just went into it. He went into it blind, not really knowing what I was going to do. Other than that, I wanted to essentially compete with him. And I think that the thing that I found most interesting is that I ended up trying to, I climbed him, but the only way I was really able to do it was by him helping me. And so for me, that became like the primary interest from doing that, was that the only way I was able to find some way to actually win a competition was if he helped me. And so again, there's that tenderness that's involved in creating a fluidity around strength and power. So these two images, clearly the one on the right is Arnold Schwarzenegger. The one on the left is me. These are other things that were kind of in my head, and I was thinking about as I was shifting into making work that was more directly about mountains, geography, power, strength, heroism. And I was looking at this image of Arnold Schwarzenegger and the way that he's standing with his skis on the top of this mountain with these other mountains behind him, and how the ways in which that communicates power, and the ways in which the vista that we're looking at behind him also supports his depiction of power, and how landscape and power are intertwined, how mountains and power are intertwined. Again, the one on the other side is me as a, I don't know, 7 or 8 year old. And it's a very different depiction of like what it means to be skiing, what it means to be on a mountain. But there was also for me an interest in returning to the space of the mountain, which was for me as a child where I probably was the most happy. And it was this place where I could just be up there and kind of forget about everything. And also really thinking about like how that happened within spaces that were incredibly mediated, because ski resorts were manicured and they would, they do preventative avalanches that they set off with dynamite to prevent larger avalanches. So there's all these strange like risk preventions that happen within those spaces. And I was really interested in exploring that dynamic of looking at the ways that these interactions with nature were mediated, and also looking at the power dynamics that underlie that mediation and the power dynamics that underlie representations of mountains and geography. And this is another example to talk about that. This is a clipping from Life magazine from 1945. And the magazine was all about mountaineering. And what stuck out to me, and what had been sticking out to me in so much literature and writing around mountaineering, was the word conquering was constantly used to talk about summiting mountains. And so again, going back to what I was talking previously with the Matterhorn, was this idea of how mountains were connected to the expansion of empire through the idea of owning through conquering, through summiting, through being the first to the top. Like there was these races to be the first to the top of these mountains, and from specific countries. And also how much this was, and looking at this, being very critical of how much this was a very privileged sport, a very white European sport that really promoted supremacy and conquering space, conquering land, and literally being on the top. And so it mirrored so many of those kind of inherent power structures. And in thinking about that, I created a series called The Order of Mont Bleu, in which I constructed 4 or 5 pieces of abstracted mountain forms that were just cut out of very simple plywood and just painted. And then I would go into the studio and I would move them around and photograph myself doing that. And I would lift them up. Like, so in this image, it's lifted over my head, over my shoulder. And thinking about that idea, the idea of recreating these mountains in a way where there literally is no conquest involved, because the objects are so abstracted and simplified that there's literally no accomplishment in me being able to lift it and put it over my shoulder. In addition, I was thinking a lot about theatrical set design, and working with flat pieces and abstracting in geometric ways to make everything look fake, so that it was clear that I was creating a stage. And I wanted that to parody the idea of, to essentially be saying that this idea of a mountain being conquered is not real, just as my set that I'm building is not real. Your idea that you are a hero for reaching the top first is really, it's a lie, it's fake. There's so much staging and pomp that goes into that. And this is the last piece from that series. And so that's what I was thinking about in regards to these specific pieces. And again, just wanting to turn it into something that was beyond easy, and so took out that element of heroism. From here, I started to think a little bit more about monolith forms. So I had mentioned it when I talked about my piece just below in regards to thinking about the monolith forms in minimalist sculpture. And then I started to think about those forms in nature and how in similar ways they very much communicated power and strength, verticality, and I wanted to start working with those types of forms to be able to more directly address some of those ideas around power, strength, verticality. And so the image on the left is an image by the photographer Timothy O'Sullivan from the 19th century. And then the image on the other side was taken through my car windshield, driving through, I'm not sure if I'm in Colorado or Utah here, but driving through there and just looking at the forms of the shadows of the different rock and mountain formations that we were viewing. This again, so going back to like just showing a little bit of things in progress, and the ways that I go from maquettes to larger scale pieces. And so these are images of maquettes that I was working with as I was developing the work that I'm going to be showing you. And so this is the first image I'll show you from this body of work. And this body of work is called Composing Land, because it's thinking about ways that the depiction and representation of landscapes are very much constructions. And so similar to the prior piece, The Order of Mont Bleu, I really wanted to create images in ways where the production was really clear. And so the materials were visible. I was using hypersaturated colors. I wanted to make the elements that went into building the image really visible, because the images for me talk about ways that depictions of landscapes are not depictions of actual real spaces. They're more ideological depictions that reflect political or social constructs of the times in which they were made, and or very directly backed very like specific political causes, such as ideas around manifest destiny, which in 19th century American landscape painting was the most common theme. And these paintings were used to justify ideas about the American West being the rightful and religiously divined property of white European Americans. And so the work thinks through how landscape as a form is a construction of elements to communicate a message. And so again, for me, what I do is make those constructions visible. For me, there's this conversation within photography that has always been of interest about how much the photograph is a document and how much it's a construction. And so I want to play with that truth and that like kind of line of truth within the photographic surface in my work, and always be doubting that and questioning that and finding ways to manipulate that. And in these works, I do that a lot by drawing attention to the fact that it is very fake, and that the landscapes are so abstract that they almost become not landscapes anymore, even though that's what the original reference was. So in some of these images I am performing and hanging from these pieces or sort of standing within them. This piece is called Intercepting Mountains of Men. And so again, it's thinking back to ideas around mountaineering and the like masculinity and heroism surrounding that sport and that culture and mentality. This one is called Another Ascent. And for me, this one, I was thinking a bit more about that space in between the two pieces and how long it goes. And there's a lot of ways in my work around landscape where I try to bring in elements of the unknown. And so I often use a lot of black. I put a lot of things in shadow. And for me, that's a way of talking about the fact that there's so many things unseen when we look at the land and when we look at representations of it. And often in representing land, there's this, there's a desire to control, a desire to know everything. And in my work, I want to admit the inability to actually know everything and really be looking at landscape as a space that's not neutral, to really say like, hey, all of these representations that we come across, whether they are art historical images, whether they are vernacular images or personal images, they're not neutral. The way that we look at land is not neutral. And then again, just to show you guys a bit more in progress, kind of what my studio looks like when I'm doing this stuff. And so on the right with the ladders, that was how I was standing on top of these pieces, was by hanging over the two boards that were up there, and then all the cardboard I'm using for blocking my lights so that I get the really dark black in the background or the bright colors in the background. And then the other one is the pieces in the wood shop. And then another thing is, it's not always clear in the images, but most of these pieces that I work with are pretty large. So these ones were between 6 and like 7 or 8 feet, something like that. And then I'll show you just a few more things that are much more recent that I've been working on. And so more recently, I've been looking at other people's images of landscapes and kind of reappropriating those. One of the specific photographers I've been looking at is Vittorio Sella, because he really specifically, the book is called Summit. He photographed a lot of mountain summits, especially in the Alps and in Europe. And then the image on the right, William Dasonville, an early landscape photographer, photographing the same kind of vista in Yosemite that's photographed over and over. And then a more vernacular image on the other side from a book about the Rocky Mountains. And so what I've been doing is looking at these different images and pulling them apart and collaging them and covering them up and like pulling and tearing paper away, and thinking through like different ways that like images communicate or hide things, and what's kind of like layered underneath them. And then this is another one from what I've been working on. And this is the last image I'll show you. And this is just to kind of look at, again, like how do I work, and showing all of the things that go on behind the scenes and what the shoot looks like, to go from here to here. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then if there's questions, we can go ahead and do a little Q&A. Okay, I see there's already questions. This is from Clement Olivares. Hi, Anna. You mentioned that in these performances, you put your body at risk. I would like to know if you have hurt yourself badly and if you are interested in recording these scenes after the falls. I mean, maybe your bruises or scars. So actually, I really haven't ever hurt myself badly doing any of these performances. It's always been more, I mean, there's been, yeah, plenty of scrapes and some bruises, but nothing really major. I do as much as I can really try to build in safety for myself. And so when I was doing the piece sawing off the board, I had the two mats mattresses underneath me. And even before I did the shoot, I practiced falling on them to just see what the distance was like. And I had somebody else in the room with me while I was shooting in case something happened. And in the piece where I'm standing in the long column, I do have a little something I can hold on to on the top for when I fell. So, but yeah, good question. And I do get that a lot. Yeah. Okay. The next one is from Regina Chavez. Hi, Anna. Is there a piece that has been particularly difficult to perform, film, or photograph? Can you tell us about it? So I think that the piece Protecting Popo, the two photographs from that probably took me the longest. And one was the fact that I started working on the piece, shooting it live in the museum. And so I couldn't control my lighting. And so I did about 3 shoots there. And then after that, I decided I wanted to bring him into my own studio to work, to have it be more private and have more control. And I also decided I wanted to ask him to be nude. I wanted him to be nude because I wanted it to more directly reference sculpture and painting and the nude body, and in that way to make it more vulnerable and more intimate. So then I brought him into my studio, and I think we shot 3 or 4 different times there for like probably 3 or 4 hours each. And it was in the summer in LA, and it was boiling hot, and I had the hottest studio ever. And it was really, really hard to shoot. And the type of lighting that I was doing was so precise, but I wasn't in front of the camera. And so I had to rely a lot on assistants for trying to tell me where the light was falling. And so I had to shoot a lot to get the images that I needed, because there was just a lot of error. And because I was working with another person, it's much more comfortable for me to work alone. And yeah, I think that piece was definitely the hardest piece that I've shot, for all of those reasons. Yeah. Okay. And one more question from Adderly Sofía Fuentes. Hola, Ana, me preguntaba si piensas al cuerpo como actos coreográficos, si planeas tus movimientos o si es todo espontáneo. Piensa esa relación entre tu cuerpo y los objetos que utilizas en tus acciones como objetos que también actúan y determinan tus movimientos entre ellos y contigo. Sí, me gusta esa pregunta. Cuando era más joven, era bailarina y estudiaba muchas formas de danza, incluye ballet, la danza moderna y postmoderna. Y esas prácticas han influenciado mi práctica. Disculpa, mi español no es tan perfecto, pero voy a tratar de responder en español. Pero entonces, cuando hace mis acciones, siempre sí pienso en el coreográfica y también mis movimientos. Y sí, estoy muy interesada en la interacción entre los objetos y mi cuerpo. Y para mí, creo que los objetos que crean, ¿cómo se dice? Pues que crean espacios para mover, y que los objetos interrumpir mis movimientos. Y para mí sí creo que es una forma de coreografía. Pero también en muchos de mis videos pensaba mucho en el, ¿cómo se dice? Que sí, fueron un poco espontáneos también los movimientos, porque estaba reaccionando a los objetos. Y antes del performance no practiqué. No practiqué mis movimientos ni nada. Me quería entrar a la acción sin entender cómo puedo mover. Y también porque cuando tenía 24 o 25, entre 24 y 28 años, que practicaba mucho formas de, ¿cómo se dice en español? Pues en inglés improvisational dance. Y creo que esta práctica sí informa mucho mi práctica en mi arte. Okay. Pues hay otras preguntas. Anyone else have any other questions?
Creo que ya no hay más preguntas, Ana.
Ok,
Por parte
está bien, perfecto.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Ana, por compartirnos tu práctica, por hablarnos de todos estos proyectos que tienes. También agradezco profundamente a todas las personas que nos acompañaron el día de hoy en este miércoles de SOMA, que comentaron y preguntaron y dialogaron con Ana. Yo les quiero invitar a que se suscriban a nuestro canal. En caso de que no lo hayan hecho, pueden aquí en YouTube encontrar todos los miércoles de SOMA de los meses pasados. Y recuerden que todos los miércoles del año son miércoles de SOMA y nos gustaría mucho que estuvieran el próximo 4 de agosto, que estará la artista Ana Segovia también platicándonos más de sus proyectos. Entonces, pues una vez más, Ana, muchas gracias por estar aquí y gracias a todos los demás. Bonita noche. Hasta luego.